Dark clouds hung over the Heartland Ranch, and a sudden gust of wind rattled the barn doors. The air felt heavy, like something terrible was about to happen. Tim Fleming, once confident and unstoppable, was about to face the deal that would destroy everything he had worked for. Money, power, reputation, all of it teetered on the edge of collapse. No one could have predicted how quickly one decision could turn his life upside down. Every handshake, every signature, every promise was about to come back to haunt him in ways that would leave the entire ranch reeling. Tim Fleming sat at his desk, papers neatly stacked, a smug smile playing on his lips. To the outside world, he looked calm, in control, untouchable. But behind that confident smile, there was a hint of nervous excitement. This was the deal that could finally put him above everyone else in Heartland. He had spent months negotiating, planning, and making promises he wasn't sure he could keep. But for now, everything seemed perfect. The ranch outside buzzed with its usual activity. Horses moved gracefully in the fields. The soft murmur of the river added a peaceful rhythm. The scent of fresh hay drifted through the air. Amy and the others were busy with their daily chores, unaware of the storm brewing in Tim's office. They trusted him more, at least. They thought they did. Little did they know, the trust was about to be shattered. Tim leaned back in his chair, rubbing his hands together. He glanced at the contract in front of him, the one that promised to secure his power and his wealth. On paper, it looked foolproof. A handshake here, a signature there, and he would be untouchable. The numbers added up perfectly. The terms seemed fair, and the partners involved appeared legitimate. It was all too easy, too clean. And in Tim's world, that was often the first warning sign. Outside the office window, the wind picked up, rustling the leaves and sending a chill down the spine of anyone who noticed. Tim didn't notice. He was focused on the numbers, the possibilities, the victory. He didn't see the small cracks forming in the foundation of his plan. He didn't hear the whispers of doubt from those who had seen his past mistakes, and he certainly didn't imagine how quickly the perfect deal could turn into a nightmare in the nearby fields. Caleb noticed something odd. A shipment truck was parked near the stables at an unusual hour, its engine idling softly. He frowned but didn't think much of it. Heartland had deliveries all the time. Yet something about the timing felt off, a little too coincidental. He shook his head and went back to tending the horses, unaware that the first signs of disaster were already arriving at the ranch. Inside, Tim's phone buzzed. A text from one of the deal's partners. "Everything is ready. Tomorrow will be big." Tim's smile widened. He didn't read the hidden warning behind the message, the subtle hint that not everything was as it seemed. His confidence blinded him to the looming danger. To the people who might exploit every weakness, every misstep, as the sun began to set over Heartland. Painting the sky in shades of orange and red, Tim finally leaned back, relaxed. To him, the night signaled a job well done, a deal ready to cement his legacy. But in the shadows of the office and across the ranch, unseen forces were already moving, setting the stage for the chaos that would soon consume him. One deal, one mistake, and everything he loved and worked for would begin to crumble before his eyes. Tim Fleming walked out of his office, contract folder in hand, his steps confident but slightly rushed. To anyone watching, it seemed like a man in control, ready to conquer the world. But behind that air of certainty, a storm was already brewing. This wasn't just another business agreement, this was the deal that had the potential to change everything. And not in Tim's favor. From the very start, it carried a hidden weight, a secret flaw that even the smartest people might overlook. Across the ranch, Amy noticed Tim's unusually tense expression. He was usually precise, almost predictable in his mannerisms. But today there was something different, a shadow behind his eyes. Something hurried him, something he couldn't show to anyone. Caleb, standing nearby, caught the tension too. The way Tim clutched the folder, the slight twitch in his jaw, the sharp glances he cast toward the horizon hinted at a man walking on a knife's edge. Yet no one could guess just how sharp that edge really was. The deal itself was simple on paper. It's almost elegant in its structure. But the elegance was deceiving. It promised profit, expansion, and a stronger foothold in Heartland's future. What it didn't show were the traps buried in the fine print. Tim was so focused on the immediate rewards that he didn't stop to think about the long-term consequences. There were warnings in every clause, subtle hints that an untrained eye would never notice. But one mistake, one overlooked detail, could unravel years of work in a matter of hours. As Tim drove toward the meeting location, the tension in the air seemed to follow him. The roads were quiet, the trees swaying in the wind, shadows stretching longer with the approaching evening. There was a strange stillness that made the moment feel heavier than it should. Tim felt it too, though he tried to ignore it. Deep down, a small voice whispered that this deal wasn't just another step forward, it might be the beginning of the end. At the meeting place, two men waited, their faces hidden in the dim light of the barn. They were smooth, professional, and entirely unreadable. They smiled at Tim, shaking hands, showing nothing of their intentions. Tim, blinded by ambition, returned the smiles with equal confidence. Every word spoken, every nod given, seemed routine. But underneath the surface, the foundation of Tim's world was already cracking. The deal was moving forward. The cracks would soon widen into a chasm he couldn't escape. Back at the ranch, Amy's intuition began to flare. She couldn't explain it, but something about this deal felt wrong. The way Tim had avoided her gaze that morning, the hurried phone calls he had made. The unusual secrecy, all signs pointed to trouble. Yet even as she sensed danger, she didn't fully understand its scale. She only knew that the calm before the storm never lasted. And storms in Heartland tended to hit harder than anyone expected as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows over the fields. The meeting began. Tim signed the first papers, shook hands, and nodded at the men across from him. On the surface, it looked like business as usual, but hidden behind the formalities was a silent countdown, one that would soon mark the beginning of the chaos that would destroy him. One misstep, one hidden clause, one moment of blind trust, and Tim Fleming's empire would start to crumble in ways he couldn't even imagine. The next morning, the ranch felt different. There was a subtle tension in the air, like the calm before a sudden storm. Tim Fleming walked through the barn, greeting staff with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Inside, the contract from yesterday's deal sat on his desk, neatly stacked but already weighing heavily on him. At first, he told himself everything was fine. The numbers added up. The signatures were complete, and the partners had assured him all was ready. Yet somewhere deep down, Tim felt that small, nagging unease he had learned to ignore over the years. By mid-morning, the first warning signs began to appear. A phone call interrupted Tim while he reviewed some ranch accounts. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, but the message was anything but simple. We need to revisit some of the terms. There's been an oversight. Tim frowned, his confident exterior faltering just slightly. Oversight? That word carried a weight he hadn't expected. He brushed it off, telling himself it was minor, easily corrected. But even small cracks in a deal like this could quickly widen into disastrous fractures. Meanwhile, Amy and Caleb had started noticing the tension spreading like a ripple across the ranch. Horses were restless, chores were interrupted, and workers whispered quietly to one another. Amy felt a tight knot in her stomach as she watched him pace the office, the contract clutched tightly in his hands. Something was wrong, and she had a sinking feeling that it had everything to do with the deal he had rushed into. Her instincts had never failed her before. Now they screamed that the calm Tim projected was a fragile mask, ready to shatter at any moment. Outside, dark clouds gathered over the fields. The wind carried a chill, rustling hay and sending birds scattering from the fence posts. It seemed as if nature itself was echoing the unrest Tim had unknowingly invited into his life. Every step he took toward securing his future with this deal was now shadowed by uncertainty. And the ranch, usually a place of safety and comfort, was starting to feel foreign, tense, almost threatening. By midday, more complications emerged. The partners involved in the deal began sending urgent messages, requesting immediate corrections, clarifications, and additional commitments. Tim tried to manage it all with his usual poise, but cracks were showing. Documents that once seemed perfectly aligned now looked messy and complicated. and the hidden pitfalls of the contract revealed themselves in subtle but dangerous ways. What he thought was control was quickly slipping into chaos. Caleb, noticing Tim's growing frustration, tried to approach cautiously. "Everything okay, Tim?" he asked. Tim forced a smile, nodding, but his hands betrayed him, trembling slightly as he shuffled papers. Amy, watching from across the room, stepped closer, her voice soft but firm. "Tim, is there something you're not telling us?" For the first time in years, Tim didn't have a confident answer. There was a pause, heavy with tension, as he realized the weight of his choices might already be too much to manage alone. As evening fell, the ranch seemed to hold its breath. Shadows lengthened across the fields, and the once bright horizon turned a dull, threatening gray. Tim sat back in his chair, staring at the contract that was supposed to secure his empire. But now, it felt like a trap one he had willingly walked into. One misstep, one hidden clause, and the world he had built with such care could start collapsing around him. And at that very moment, the first threads of his downfall were quietly, inevitably being pulled by the next morning. The calm that had briefly settled over Heartland was gone. The ranch, usually alive with the sounds of horses and laughter, felt heavy and strained. Tim Fleming's confidence from just a day before had evaporated, replaced by a tight, uneasy energy that seemed to radiate from him wherever he went. Every glance from his staff felt like a judgment. Every phone call carried a hidden threat. The deal that was supposed to cement his success was now the source of his first real panic. Tim's office phone rang relentlessly, each call bringing news more troubling than the last. One partner had discovered an error in the contract, something small but legally binding. Another had withdrawn their commitment entirely, leaving gaps in the financial plan that Tim had counted on. Even minor mistakes that would normally be overlooked were now magnified, twisting the deal into something unrecognizable. For the first time, Tim realized that the perfect plan he had celebrated might have been nothing more than an illusion. Across the ranch, Amy watched the unfolding chaos with growing concern. She noticed Tim's usual swagger had disappeared. His movements were hurried, his expressions guarded. The worry in her chest grew as she followed him from a distance. Noticing the way he scribbled notes frantically, called people, and seemed to shrink under the weight of the deal he had once viewed as a triumph. Something about the situation felt dangerously out of control. And Amy knew that the consequences would not stop at Tim alone. They could ripple through the entire ranch. Even the horses seemed to sense the tension. They were skittish, restless, and harder to manage than usual. Tasks that had once been routine now required double the effort. And the ranch hands whispered nervously about Tim's sudden mood swings and the unexpected calls from lawyers and partners. The once steady heartbeat of Heartland was now a drum of unease, each beat echoing the growing disaster stemming from a single, ill-fated decision. As the day wore on, the first real signs of financial damage appeared. Notices, letters, and warnings piled onto Tim's desk, each one a tangible symbol of the unraveling deal. Expenses that had been carefully calculated now exceeded projections. Deadlines were looming, and the trust he had built with his allies was fraying. For Tim, the reality was impossible to ignore. This was no longer about ambition or strategy. It was survival, and the odds were stacked against him. Caleb and Amy tried to step in, offering advice and assistance, but Tim's pride made him hesitant. He waved off suggestions, insisting he could handle it alone, even as the cracks widened. His stubbornness, combined with the magnitude of the deal's fallout, only made the situation more dangerous. Amy could see it. Tim was a man who had underestimated how fragile success could be, and now he was paying the price. By sunset, the damage was undeniable. Heartland felt different, tense, almost haunted. Tim sat in the quiet of his office, reviewing the growing list of problems, the letters, the warnings, the threats, all proof that one deal had the power to unravel everything he had built. The ranch, the staff, the animals, and even the trust of those around him were at stake. And as darkness settled across the fields, the realization sank in. Some deals are not meant to be won, and some mistakes cannot be undone. The next morning, the atmosphere at Heartland was tense, thick with unspoken worries. Tim Fleming had always been seen as a man who could handle pressure, but now even the most loyal allies began to question him. Amy, Caleb, and a few trusted ranch hands watched from a distance as Tim moved through the barn and stables with a forced sense of calm. There was a heaviness to his steps, a stiffness in his posture, and an unease in his voice that betrayed the chaos he was trying desperately to hide. Amy approached cautiously, knowing the right words could either help or push him further away. "Tim, we need to talk," she said, her voice firm but gentle. Tim didn't look up at her immediately, his eyes scanning the horizon as if searching for a solution in the distance. "I've got it under control," he replied, but the words sounded hollow, even to him. He clenched his fists around the contract folder, the paper cutting slightly through his grip. Pride and fear were colliding, and neither allowed him to show weakness. Across the ranch, Caleb and two of the ranch hands whispered quietly near the fence. "I don't know if Tim can handle this," one murmured, glancing toward the office where Tim was locked in a flurry of calls and notes. "He's in over his head," the other added. These murmurs were harmless on their own, but Tim could sense the doubt, even if he pretended not to. The trust that had been the foundation of Heartland's success now felt shaky, as if it might collapse under the weight of one bad decision. The deal's consequences weren't just financial, they were personal. Partners who had once respected Tim now called with sharp tones, demanding answers and accountability. Every misstep was highlighted, every oversight magnified. And Tim's reputation began to crack in ways he hadn't imagined possible. Amy noticed it too, how quickly people who seemed loyal yesterday could turn cold today when money and mistakes were involved. Heartland was a community built on trust, and Tim was learning the hard way how fragile that trust could be in the office. Tim's hands shook as he flipped through the contracts again, looking for a loophole, a mistake, anything that could save him. But the deeper he looked, the more he realized the trap he had walked into. Every clause, every agreement, every handshake he had made carried hidden risks. Risks that were now coming to life in the form of angry calls, unpaid promises, and strained relationships. The realization was suffocating. One wrong move, and the people who had once stood by him could walk away forever. Amy tried a different approach, stepping closer and speaking softly. "Tim, you don't have to do this alone. We can help you figure it out, but you need to trust us." Tim paused, his pride battling with the mounting pressure. Trust had always been his strength, yet now he felt the walls closing in. Every ally, every friend, every connection he had relied on seemed to hang by a thread. The deal hadn't just created problems with finances, it had begun to fracture the very foundation of his support system. As the sun climbed higher, tension at Heartland reached a boiling point. Tim's allies were no longer silent observers, they were questioning, doubting, and beginning to act independently to protect what they could. The cracks in the ranch's harmony mirrored the cracks in Tim's own confidence. And as the shadows stretched across the fields, it became painfully clear. This deal didn't just threaten Tim Fleming's wealth, it threatened the loyalty, trust, and unity that had kept Heartland strong for years. By late afternoon, the calm Tim Fleming once commanded had vanished entirely. The ranch was alive with tension, and every corner seemed to echo the growing chaos. Tim's office was a whirlwind of papers, contracts, and urgent messages. Each one a reminder that the deal he had thought was perfect was unraveling faster than he could handle. His hands trembled slightly as he rifled through documents, his normally sharp mind clouded with worry. Every call that rang through his phone carried a new problem, and each one chipped away at his confidence. Outside the office, Amy paced quietly, her gaze fixed on Tim as he sat slumped behind the desk. She had tried every approach, gentle reminders, calm advice, and even tough questions, but Tim seemed trapped in his own pride and fear. His desperation was now visible, though still carefully masked behind quick, controlled gestures. Yet even the smallest cracks in his composure told a story of a man who had underestimated the weight of one bad deal. Tim's desperation wasn't just about money or the deal itself, it was about control. For the first time, he realized that he wasn't in control anymore. Partners had pulled back, deadlines loomed, and his reputation within the ranch and the wider community was at stake. Every decision felt like a gamble, and even minor miscalculations now carried devastating consequences. He had once prided himself on seeing opportunities where others saw risk, but now risk was swallowing opportunity whole. The tension at Heartland was palpable. Caleb and the ranch hands moved through their daily tasks cautiously, aware of the invisible pressure that hung over the property. Even the horses sensed it, moving with a restless energy that mirrored the unease surrounding Tim. Every sound, every movement seemed amplified, a reminder that something critical was about to happen. And nobody, not even Tim, could stop it entirely. In the office, Tim tried to salvage the situation by calling each partner individually, explaining, negotiating, and even begging where necessary. But the responses were firm and unyielding. Mistakes once considered forgivable were now highlighted and scrutinized. Tim's usual charisma, the charm that had once smoothed over so many rough deals, seemed powerless against the chain reaction he had unleashed. The walls of his carefully constructed empire were closing in, and for the first time, he felt truly vulnerable. Amy stepped forward again, placing a hand on the edge of Tim's desk. "Tim, you can't fix this alone. You need us. You need to face it before it gets worse." Tim looked up, eyes shadowed with fear and frustration. Pride battled with logic, and the man who had always seemed untouchable now appeared fragile, almost broken. The realization hit him like a punch. This deal didn't just threaten his finances, it threatened his future, his relationships, and the very life he had built at Heartland. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the ranch, the weight of Tim's decisions became impossible to ignore. His desperation had reached a critical point, and with every passing minute, the consequences of the deal became more severe. Letters of warning, angry calls, and mounting stress surrounded him like an invisible storm. Tim Fleming had finally learned the hard truth. Some mistakes cannot be fixed. Some deals cannot be controlled, and sometimes, one wrong choice can destroy everything you thought you had. Night had fallen over Heartland, and the ranch was quiet, too quiet. The usual sounds of horses and wind through the trees were now tinged with a heavy, foreboding silence. Inside his office, Tim Fleming sat surrounded by the chaos he could no longer control. Papers were scattered across the desk, phones continued to ring unanswered, and messages of frustration and anger blinked relentlessly on his screen. The deal that promised triumph had become a living nightmare, consuming everything he had worked for. Outside, Amy and Caleb exchanged worried glances. The ranch had begun to feel like a battlefield, each corner a reminder of how quickly things could unravel. Broken fences, restless animals, and tense workers mirrored the internal collapse Tim was experiencing. It wasn't just numbers on a page anymore. The deal had real consequences, impacting the lives of everyone who depended on Heartland. Trust had been fractured, and relationships were strained beyond repair. Tim's mind raced as he reread the contracts, searching desperately for a way out. Every loophole he had hoped for was gone. Every promise of stability had turned into a liability. Panic began to settle in as the reality hit. This wasn't a mistake that could be fixed with a call or a signature. The destruction was total and undeniable. Partners withdrew support, payments were delayed or canceled, and whispers of betrayal spread through the community. Tim Fleming, once seen as untouchable, now faced the undeniable truth he had overreached. And Heartland was paying the price. Amy approached quietly, standing just behind him. "Tim, you need to face this," she said softly. "Hiding won't help. Owning it, fixing what we can together, that's the only way forward." Tim looked up, exhaustion and fear etched deep into his face. The pride that had always defined him was gone, replaced by raw vulnerability. He realized that this deal didn't just destroy wealth or opportunity, it threatened everything that mattered. His reputation, his relationships, and the very community he had tried to dominate. The camera lingers on Tim's hands, trembling over the scattered papers, a symbolic image of the collapse of control. Outside, the ranch lights flickered against the night sky. as if mirroring the uncertainty and chaos that now defined the property. Every horse in the barn shifted nervously, every creak of wood and whisper of wind echoing the tension. The deal's consequences were no longer abstract. They were real, visible, and irreversible. Finally, Tim slumped back in his chair, staring blankly at the contracts. A single thought repeated in his mind. One deal had destroyed everything he had built. The screen fades to shadow, leaving only the echo of his mistakes lingering in the air. Amy and Caleb's silhouettes stand in the doorway, a reminder that even in destruction, support and redemption are possible if he's willing to accept it. The narration concludes with a chilling final line. Tim Fleming learned the hardest lesson of all. Sometimes ambition blinds you, and one wrong deal can destroy not just your fortune, but your life. And in Heartland, no mistake goes unnoticed. The screen fades to black, leaving viewers with suspense, shock, and a hunger to see how the story continues in the next episode.